Pae White's accelerating and experimental oeuvre has continued to evolve in its roaming across different material forms and contexts, including large-scale sculptures and installations, public artworks, interior and graphic design projects, textiles and animation, with a sense of exuberant abandon. White revels in the rapport between art, design, the applied arts, and architecture while questioning the traditional and often nebulous boundaries between them. So, Pae White.
Here we are.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to show a lot of work pretty quickly, but if there's any questions, just feel free to shout out, at will. And I'm done. Well, I'm going to start with, I actually thought I would show a lot of the kind of outdoor pieces, and I think it's important to start with this image. I was early on when I graduated from school, I was always sort of asking questions about what was maybe appropriate for public sculpture, what maybe seemed inappropriate. And I was also sort of simultaneously collecting the textiles of this designer, Vera Newman, who I found to be quite an inspiration. She just designed everything in the house I grew up in. My bed sheets were designed by her, the Kleenex, the curtains, everything was this person. And so I started to collect it, and I was amassing really thousands of these. And every time I would find one, it would be different from the next. And I found that very interesting. Just she sort of looked at the world in terms of its potential to be a textile. And it's kind of a nice thing to collect because it was like a quarter and it wouldn't break. And so I had this collection of her work, and I was asked to be one of the first exhibitions when I got out of school. Was this show that was at the American Center in Paris and went to MOCA in Los Angeles. And there were 6 other artists, and people were kind of competitive for space, and I decided to kind of claim the outdoors because no one was interested in that. And I thought, it felt like I wanted to give for these outdoor sculptures, I wanted to do these mini retrospectives of this designer Vera. And just this idea of a scarf and with a chair and an ashtray being sort of a scenario for a public sculpture, and the fragility of the scarf and the inevitable damage being part of the piece. And so these were sealed around the edges, and it was tempered glass, and I had one giant, you can see in the distance, a California King flat sheet. So it was like this massive, it's a double piece of glass. And in Paris, I just kind of was sort of random about it. I scattered them here and there. And in Los Angeles, when the show came to Los Angeles, I decided to take a more curatorial approach, and I went within the collection, and I would have ones that was maybe the elements or plaid or sadness or architecture, but they were these kind of just more thematic. Mm-hmm.
Between the glass, is this the real fabric? Or
Yes, it's the real fabric. And they faded. I mean, this is silk and cotton, and they faded, and that's what I wanted. And I wanted the ashtray to be just a small suggestion of passing time in front of a napkin, really, something kind of really crazy like that. And then a few years later, I was asked to do a project in upstate New York near Beacon, where there's a lot of small organic farms, and was specifically directed to this site called Bear Mountain State Park. And I was interested in that, well, you'll see to the right, there is a crumbling barbecue, and I wanted to provide a metal sculpture in the landscape that would sort of function and serve a purpose, and also over time just become red, like these traditional red sculptures in the landscape. And that you could also cook food from the organic farms on these pieces. And inevitably, because they're cast iron, they started to get red and rusty, and just kind of what I wanted. This piece, did I miss something? No, that has an open back. This was an exhibition I did in Berlin, and what's interesting to me is this piece on the floor, this orange slab, which is made of laminated plexiglass. And it's made in such a way that the solvent sets up immediately. And it's something I came across when I failed at trying to make it be completely without bubbles. And it just set up and it looked like moving water, but it was completely inert. But I liked the kind of chaos of the space, of this idea of a body of water in the space. And I like this frozenness cutting through the space and directing the viewer in a very specific pattern. And then on top of, running right across the top of that was a piece that I made of hundreds of pieces of layered painted paper, and it has a very dense color. And I wanted this idea of an aviary, it's called aviary, this aviary that's just been kicked up in this kind of this chaos of birds being frozen and creating like a geometry of chaos that then cuts across this sort of body of water. In this piece, you'll see it's very kind of bright, sweet colors. I sort of jammed this other color motif of sort of political colors just right through the center. I think that was at the time of the Bush second election, but I was just thinking about it. And then this piece came to the Hammer, and as you probably all know, in the Hammer space, that's a really tricky space. I mean, it is a lobby for a corporate lobby, and I was interested in all those problems. What were sort of liabilities of that space? I wanted to really play with these hanging pieces, and some of the other things, other sort of liabilities of that space was the fact that the lights couldn't be adjusted, and you really had to take it as it is. And so I kind of wanted to pretend certain parts of it were not there and play up other parts. And so that piece aviary cut right through this railing just as if it just had to go away. And then this inability to direct the light, I started to build the pieces around directly underneath, and the nice thing that happened, I found these color ghosts happening through the proximity of the light onto the high density pigment paper. It just would glow with reflected light. And also there's a fire issue. You couldn't have something block that part of the staircase. So I went in and made these kind of indents, and the piece was already sort of hung at pond, I would like to think of it as pond level. But these indents would allow the viewer to kind of enter the piece and see that this 26 feet of bright orange line stopped like 6 inches from the strand of paper and created this kind of hover, extra hover, which you can I don't know if you can see, but also when you would enter the piece and look in, you would have all this kind of, at pond level, all these sort of eye things, or cat's eyes looking back, this sort of reflection of looking back as you look down. And again, this problem of these lights were really nice. They showed me things about these pieces that I had never thought to do. And other weird parts of the space you might notice are these strange little, side rooms or weird dead ends and odd spaces. So I decided to plug into those spaces these mixed media bird cage pieces that had at the bottom of them scraps of clippings that were not, big worldly issues, but they were issues that were important to me, like insurance for self-employed and, interest rates and things that you sort of struggle with as an artist if you haven't taken business classes or things like that. So these bird cages were made with that information and some junk mail, coupons, but they were plugged into these spaces that you might find one when you turned a corner, and then hopefully the viewer would start to wonder if there were other pieces that were watching the viewer, or you would just have this other kind of sort of a treasure hunt in a way. This project was in Delme, France, and it was a decommissioned synagogue, and really beautiful space with its crumbling cupola. And I wanted to plug in one of these pieces again that you could enter, and painted the whole bottom space almost as if you were entering a pool, this very, very high gloss blue. And then you can see on the second floor, which is also a continuation of the exhibition space, this kind of salmon color paint, or what appeared to be like a salmon peach-colored, soft peach-colored paint. And understanding that viewers would go up there and look down. Oh, and I'm just showing this. This doesn't look like anything, but it's wire that we had to use to suspend the piece from diagonally because the cupola was coming apart. And this wire came back in other work, you'll see. But so one would go upstairs to see this from above and expect this kind of soft painted space, but instead it was just this very hard, extreme diagonal painted floor that through the bounce of the light coming through the synagogue windows sort of painted through a blended reflection, painted the walls of this upstairs. And then I had more of these sort of birdcage pieces. And I know you guys probably know how to make this stuff. I don't, but I'm going to show a few of these pieces where I've used CNC machines, or someone has used them for me. They've done the tool paths and things like that. But I'm fascinated by some of this technology, and I wish I understood it more. So these are probably pretty simplistic, but I thought I would show them anyway. And this is a clock that was just one pattern repeated 4 times, and I just wanted this grandfather clock. I forgot to talk about the clock pieces in another slide, I realize, but and just that the line work, that these were kind of more like sort of drawings, and they were sort of ghosts and drawings, and you know. And then I had the opportunity. I'd always wanted to work with Corian, and I have actually in a previous piece I'll show. And I had the opportunity in the budget to make something I'd always wanted to make, which was an ornamental bed out of Corian. And I wanted this just beast, this thing that was like, when you touch it, it's like, has pulled all the cold in the room. And have this aesthetic where it looked like it was, the ornament was having a real struggle with the material, and the material is having a real struggle with being what it was. And so if you know Corian, it's like a solid surface material. It's very heavy, very synthetic, but it feels like marble, but it's not quilted fabric. But I wanted this feeling of this fabric struggling to get through, and also this ornament that almost felt like scar tissue, or something that was something whose making was so completely ambiguous. It wasn't like the typical high-tech CNC symmetry, but something that was just kind of messed up. And then I had the opportunity to make it out of plywood, which seemed kind of great because it has these great layers and just a different approach with the same tool paths, and where the ornament was created by burning and the detail was created by kind of pushing the tool a little bit too far and just at the point of breaking or burning, and that became the decorative element. Here's some quilting. And, pardon me? What type? No, it isn't. The person who did the tool paths has called it that. There's a little bit of a intellectual dispute there. I don't call it that. Not at all. That's too corny of a title. And then I had these panels made. I really wanted to do a whole room of paneling, and could only really afford to do 16 feet by 8 feet, I think, 4 feet. But again, just kind of the paneling, just this idea of very traditional wood paneling, but having this text of remedies, and remedies for sadness or depression and other ailments, but then having the machinery go to a point where it starts to be destructive, or the process of removal starts to destroy. And I always think it's important to talk a little bit about my interest in two-dimensional design, book design, graphics. And I was always interested at Art Center College of Design, where I went to school, but I never had, it was right at a point where they were using ruling pens and very traditional methods, and I was no good at any of that. So when the computer came, I was able to do the things that I wanted to do, but I never saw myself as a designer. I just saw myself using graphic design as a way to make art. And I was lucky also that a number of my friends needed books designed, and they didn't want to do it in-house with at a museum, so they would ask me, and I was, grateful, actually. And so I've done a number of catalogs, and we'll just show you a few. This is a project that I did with Peter Norton, Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. Oh, might be getting that wrong. Did a deck of cards in the 70s that were 100 phrases that were intended to stimulate brainstorming or creative thought. And Peter Norton bought the rights to that deck, had them translated to the 6 most commonly spoken languages in the world, and essentially came to me to design this deck. And I thought, 100 cards, they have to each be different, the front and the back. It's the only way I'll do it. And I didn't know this software. I wanted to know Adobe Illustrator, so I used this whole project to just learn Adobe Illustrator. And after maybe the 10th or 12th card, I really had no more ideas. And I didn't want to illustrate the phrases. I wanted, maybe some cases refer to them, but in the most part, I wanted my world to be the cards. And so once I kind of came to that, maybe because I was collecting that designer Vera at the time, who would make, her dinner into a scarf, or images from a movie into a scarf, I started to introduce that idea into these cards. And this is a case where I think I did go closer to illustrating my interpretation of the phrase, which in this case is "remember quiet evenings." And I was looking at Japanese erotica at the time, and I was interested in how stylized it was, and I wanted to make sort of a haiku of something already stylized, so I went through this deck and I got through 100 cards in that way. And also, this is the first time I used Corian, and it was, had a big budget, so he was paying for that, so we could afford to do it, and I was really excited to, watch the machinery cut it. That was also done on a CNC machine. And this was a book I did for Jorge Pardo for a show he did at Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles and the MCA in Chicago. And this is actually a very traditional catalog. It has has an essay, it has an interview, it has a bio, bibliography, but just in place of the images, it has this, and this is the image. This represents as close as possible his ideas around the exhibition. And what happens with this catalog, which sits on this plinth, which is a bloated hippopotamus, and the components are shrink wrapped, is then you can start to get in there and all the components fit into one box, and then they sort of terminate on top of this cardboard plinth. And but it's interesting because the museum was horrified and they thought, no one's going to buy this, but people were buying multiple copies, one so they could keep like this, others they could play with, and it was pretty cheap. And for 2 years, I did a project with Frieze magazine. The gallery I work with in Berlin took out advertising on like the 3rd page for Frieze magazine and just gave it to me. And I just get a real thrill out of seeing something going into circulation and being printed. And so they said I could do whatever I wanted on that page. And I decided to use the gallery information as kind of raw material in their artists and just their address, and just kind of went through 2 years of processing my interest at that time. I was sort of fascinated by the palette of Bakelite, that kind of clotted sort of in between colors of Bakelite, and I was interested in the back pages of the LA Weekly, which is sort of ever-growing masseuse section where the framing, the competition was trying to stand out among all these framing devices, and I just kind of merged them and put them, in the magazine. And I was fascinated with this candy. Why is it British when it looks so Japanese? And so I just wanted to play around, really, and the gallery's name is in there somewhere. I started to use my scanner as a photo studio and just started to throw debris on the scanner. And what I like about this project is that it's kind of an exhibition in print. It's never going to be, portfolio, a silkscreen edition. It's never going to be anything but what it was, which is 2 years in this magazine. And if you have those 2 years, you have the show. And if you live in Iceland, you have the show. And if you live in London, someone has a show. And the sort of ad infinitumness of the viewers and the distribution of that is something I really like. And then this magazine, it's the weirdest thing. You never see this magazine here. It's in the UK, and they asked me to do the cover of this magazine for a year, which they had 4 issues, and I thought that was like the worst title for an artist magazine, a magazine of women's art. And I just kept thinking it should be called Made, or like M-A-I-D or M-A-D-E or something. So every time I did one of these covers, I would kind of, play around with this make, the K. This was strange. But I put the design of my wedding cake on the cover, which seemed like the perfect subject for the magazine of women's art. And then just did this kind of, what I was working on at the time, went on the magazine. And this tube map is, for those of you who are familiar with this project that they do in London, I think it's a great project where they have artists do a cover of the tube map, and it circulates for 2 or 3 months, and you see this thing in the gutter. You see this, someone like opens it, doesn't even look at the art, sticks it in their pocket. It's a very interesting way to see a project that you've created, the way that it's treated in like the mass realm of a city. And I really like the artist projects where they take the color palette of the tube lines, which are really baffling to me, this kind of mint green and this red and then this pink and magenta and gray. It's got this kind of confusing logic. And use that palette into the artworks. And I decided to do that here and just use it as if they were threads into this relic, or like this thing that has an awkward presence on the cover, that it has this kind of incompleteness, and that it might be an artifact and it might be magical transport, which seemed appropriate. And then I just love, I get a thrill. I see this and it's kind of fun to see. It's up for 2 or 3 months and goes away. And this project, which is probably the largest sculpture I've ever made, is it's a project with the MTA, and I think their projects have suffer from being, from the requirement that the artist tells the place who they are. And I think I think that's kind of condescending, and I decided to approach my project from going into the Metro archives and looking at the debris and culling from their storage. And I found these crazy tickets from, 40s. And I like these weird sort of alchemical symbols and, mystery, and just kind of pulled those out and made some fabric that then is been put on a number of their bus lines and continues to be on there. And it's, and I wove my initials, my husband's and my initials are in there. And they don't even know it, but it's apparently graffiti resistant. People just don't even try. And my last transportation project, I promise, is something that was done for the Frieze Art Fair. And I had never been to an art fair, but I was asked by the fair with a number of other artists to do a project, and I had heard a rumor about VIP cars and that a fleet of BMWs would be at a fair. I just thought, well, let's see if we can do something with that. And I asked if I could, they said I could do one car. And I sent them this, and then we ended up doing this. And it was nice to have this whole group of 15 Rover sedans. And one of the things that struck me as I was going to London more and more is that the black cab was now the multicolor cab, and it was covered in advertising, and you just were kind of losing that kind of tradition of the black cab. And I wanted to wrap that and have this kind of advertising but suspended. And so you would see, throughout the city during the week of the fair, you might, they're now out of business, by the way. You would see this, and you start to get this kind of connection to things going on, it's kind of this decentralizing of the fair. If you're in one part of the city and all of a sudden one of these cars goes by, you have this weird connection and disconnection with what's happening at a sort of core. And this is a proposal material for a competition that I was shortlisted for in Oslo, and I really wanted to win this competition, and it was for their stage curtain, their opera house, which is designed by architecture firm Snoetta. And I kept thinking, when I met with Snoetta, and I realized that they're thinking they were so expansive that the stage curtain really you should think about it in terms of it being anything. And I even asked them what color were the seats in the Opera House, and they said, oh, we're going to invent a color. So I thought, okay, this is very different type of, I knew that the stakes were high. And one thing I kept going back to in my researching of the world, because that's really what I did, was thinking of anything in the world, but I kept going back to a chunk of metal or some sort of metal coming down from the ceiling, and just, why not that be a stage curtain? And this is the Opera House, so it's very, it terminates right into the fjord. It has a very interesting relationship to the landscape. And the interior is very austere. It doesn't have the traditional ornament. Anything that looks decorative is really for acoustical reasons. And this was one of my boards that I sent, and I won, which I was very pleased. And this was the final image I proposed for them, was this was foil. And what I did is once I understood what color the seat fabrics were going to be, I put pieces of paper and in the foreground of this big, this crumpled foil, and like darker versions of that. So it was this idea of shadow, of the reflection and the shadow in the reflection. But this idea that, and this is, I should explain, it's made out of cotton and polyester, so it's woven. It's not a wide format digital print, or it's not a projection. It's just a very basic, it's like a blanket, and it's a very, very basic material. And in the Opera House, so anytime you think you're seeing reflection, you're just seeing white. And anytime you think you're seeing depth, you're really just seeing something that's 3/16 of an inch thick. But I wanted there to be this kind of reflection of the immediate space around, or the illusion of that, and I wanted the viewer to feel like their space and maybe themselves were being reflected, and that maybe this becomes this kind of pre-production entertainment, and that you start to look for yourself. And that's something you do when you go to the theater or the opera. You might be looking for some story that you can, or some part of yourself. And the other thing that I wanted this piece to do, among a lot of things, but one of the things that I think was important was that it was just this very simple material and this very humble subject, but maybe that simple material can have a dream of being transformed into something reflective with depth, with effervescence and shimmer, even though it's just cotton and this kind of cotton in costume, or maybe it's the foil dressing up as cotton, but this other kind of masquerade also on stage. You see that it's very austere space. And that's me, so you sort of get a sense of the scale. And somebody said, artists always sign their art curtains, where's your signature, which I really never do, but in the documenting of this foil, we got such a high level of detail that it picked up my thumbprint from when I'd crumpled the foil to be neutral. So that's somewhere in there. And this is another outdoor project. It happens every 10 years in Münster, Germany, and it has tradition of very big, massive male projects. And I wanted to sort of ask questions about that, and a lot of these projects remain, they're still in their present form, and there's this kind of legacy of artworks, and I wanted to, kind of question that. So I did 3 projects there, and I'm going to show you 2 of them. One of the things that happens to me when I go to Germany, I can't help it, but I just get drawn into the kind of cliches of the place, like the architecture and the food, and I just go right for it. And it's interesting because Münster's a city that's been was almost completely bombed out. So a lot of that's was recreated, but it has the look and the feel of what it once was, and it's pretty convincing. But a lot of the city has a lot of bells, and the bells aren't necessarily that old, but they're everywhere. And I wanted my projects to be the biggest thing that's ever been there and the smallest thing that's ever been there. I wanted it to be everywhere all at once, and I wanted it to also just disappear. But something that would sort of blanket the city and then vanish. So for one of my projects, we programmed the bells, 5 of the bells, to play love songs that were important to me at a time of my life. And some of these bells don't work that well, which I think is important because when you think about love songs, you think about kind of breaking apart and love and difficulties. I thought that was a nice thing, that it might have a hiccup. Or this was the most complete set of bells. It was 26. It's a really kind of a carillon, a serious carillon, and the bells are in this tower here, but they're run by this little like keyboard, which is so strange. And we built this piece of machinery that then could interpret the MIDI files and hit the notes, sort of perfectly. And that was one bell. And then there was a progression, because typically a viewer would be riding a bike, so I kind of staggered the songs to kick in and then another one would kick in, so you'd sort of be a wash of these songs and then they would just go away. And it was nice because you might hear someone when the songs weren't playing, but someone would be whistling, so this sort of sculpture that got into people as well as got all over the place and then was just gone. I love these bells. These were porcelain bells that were they were ornament also outside of a cooking store, architectural ornament outside of a cooking store in Münster, and they hadn't been working for years, and we just fired them up, and we played. The songs we played were Pet Shop Boys' Rent, Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon by Neil Diamond, Shake Your Booty, Up, Up and Away, and a Beach Boys song. I can't remember. So here's Pet Shop Boys' Rent. See, it's not the cleanest version of the song, but I kind of like that it's not fully functional. And then one of the other projects I did, I was really taken by the retail zone, and it was sort of this unhip area of the city that artists had really sort of stayed away from in the past. And I was especially drawn to this cafe because it was run, you could see that the family, it was passed down generation to generation to generation, and when you would go inside, you would see all the layers of those generational interventions. So you might see an aquarium from the 70s and a teapot from the 40s, and all this really beautiful layering. And I thought, how do I get viewers inside, and how do I talk about my fascination with this side of German culture, which is like pastry making, and like this is, these people, they do like this, and I find it really interesting. And I thought, what if these people came to where I live in East LA? They might see, this, and how do we bring those together? And so my sister and I bought the best of that area on York, and we made marzipan versions to send to them, so they couldn't say no way. And we sent them an al pastor and a carne asada, and then they did this with the paper plate, which was very critical to have the right paper plate. And then I really got into this kind of grandma packaging, like with the label and the whole pastry shop and the sticker. I've always wanted to make those stickers. And I just gave them to sell. And I wanted it to be this thing that you could take the sculpture away with you, and that, it's a small, intimate thing, and you could eat it if you wanted. And then they did this. I sent them pictures, and they made this truck, and I just let them do what they do because they're better at it than I am. And they sold. The only thing that I had to correct them, they had made up this fancy plaque for the marzipan tacos, and I really wanted them to just go to their vernacular, their graphic vernacular, and just do that. So the pieces were available for the duration of the show, and then they stopped. This was a residency that I did in Northern California, and it doesn't have any stipulation. It just happens to be in the landscape, and the project is you go there for over the course of a year or two for a week here, a week there, or a month. And you can make something there, you don't have to, but the idea is that there'll be some sort of production that will be exhibited in an institution in the San Francisco area. I mean, that's really just what it is. And I decided to take the land part really literally and make work that was relentlessly of the land and of that place, which is in Nevada City, California. And one of the things that was also on this land, which was always looming, was this oak tree, this dying oak tree that was 800 years old and was going to take another 800 years to die. And it was so sensitive you couldn't even touch it because you might introduce a microbe that would accelerate, you know, the destruction of it. And then this was something that was going on there a lot in that area. I was there so many different times of the year. I really noticed when the economy changed, when they would harvest marijuana, and I thought, well, I need to work that into the project somehow. And they had these boulders everywhere with these holes in them, and the holes were these grinding holes where the Maidu Indians would grind their corn, and the particles of the granite would break it away, and you get these really nice holes. But I always noticed that these boulders were sited by the best views. So they sort of felt like these kind of first kitchens with windows, or they just always were positioned in a very interesting place. And so I thought for my first project, I was going to make clay from the land. And we made this clay, and we used cattails to bind it and put it inside these grinding holes. And the idea for me was that you would just have this kind of membrane that would have the exterior of the bowl would be the interior of the rock. And I thought, well, maybe we can make, because there's a lot of old ceramicists up there, kind of hippie ceramicists, I thought maybe we could do a raku with the marijuana, and we'll get these great psychedelic raku patterns. And I worked, I worked with this guy who's, you know, I mean, I feel like when you're doing something that's really site-specific, for me, there's all these elements that add to it. Like this ceramicist, his advice and his was a big contribution, and that talks about site for me. What ended up happening is it just was a carbon. It was just black, so nothing fancy, nothing colorful, but it was very beautiful that it was just this very light, sort of low-fired shell that documented, almost like a membrane that just sort of documented the interiors of the stones. And then I was very interested in somehow documenting this oak tree and some of the other parts of the landscape, but knowing that this oak tree was changing every second and dying every second, and we decided to have to do a 3D scan of this oak tree as well as other parts of the land. But this 3D scan that became almost like a death mask, that I just wanted the data. I just wanted, and I didn't know what I would do with it, but I would just get the data, and it was completely non-invasive and devoid of intimacy, but you're getting every bit of information from this tree, but you have never even touched it. So we got the data from that tree, and I mean, it's such a monumental tree. I kind of felt sorry for other parts of the landscape, and there's this nice little wild raspberry bush that was anything but monumental that we also scanned, and then a manzanita grove. And it was exhibited at Mills College, and I pulled out their ceramics collection, and I'm not going to get too involved in that discussion, but so then I worked with this animator from DreamWorks and Jay Yan. I don't know if he's here. He helped me with some of this. That was my first introduction to Jay Yan, to take this data and to animate it. And the thing that was interesting about this animator from DreamWorks is that I want the animation of like something dying, like, or something sick, like a sick elephant. And it's like he can just go into a motion library and run the data through another type of motion. And so this, you can kind of see, should be 16:9, but it had this kind of looming, and then it would just fall, it just kind of accelerated, then it would just kind of sway. And then the wild raspberry bush, I just wanted this sweet little thing that spun almost on like a Lazy Susan, and then just kind of dissolved, and then would slowly put itself back together. I'm just going to go to the next slide. And I want to show just some exhibition, some shows. This was a show I did at 1301 PE in 2009, and I was interested in, well, the show is called Smoke Knows, but so much of so much of the work in the show had to do with it, and it seemed like some of the processes were mysterious, and that maybe only the subject understood how it was made, and that was the title, something like that. But the gallery is a former nightgown showroom, and they used to have a fireplace in there, and I had him reveal it, pull it out from the wall again for this piece, which was made from this kind of metal canvas, or this canvas that has metal inside of it. It's two-sided canvas with metal inside of it that we made for, it represented a gutter in Pasadena that changes constantly, because I run by it when I run, and I wanted a portrait of that gutter at that time in November, so we did these leaves that are made from this material that's burned and colored, but just this kind of scatter piece of this debris that came out of the fireplace, and just this thing that's always changing. And then I had a tapestry upstairs that was the same process as the opera house, but subject was smoke. And then these paper pieces, which are cut on the laser, the subject is smoke, but the laser cuts it to just barely even holding itself together. The just sort of the membrane of the paper is barely there, and the smoke is the structure. And then I'm going to go into this, I have this one image. This piece was at the Whitney in 2010, and I was happy with where it was located on the third floor, which was predominantly film and video. And I just like this kind of banner of this kind of time, I don't know, for me, these monumental tapestry pieces, the tradition of tapestry is always something very heroic and documenting something important, or they seem to me, many of them have been. And I feel like this something moving quickly has its own kind of heroicism, or something that's the light's just about to change deserves a kind of monumentality too. And so having this kind of idea of time, when it's woven, it has a different type of embed than if it's a photograph. When you have a texture, when you have like this weave construction, it seems like it has a kind of a different type of documentation. Is he here? Oh, okay, that's my intermission. This piece was at the Whitney Biennial a few years ago, and they had just opened up this space called the Isolodo, and very old, very fragile space, and they gave me this building, and I really fell in love with the inside, and I just started to get stories of what might go on here, and I spent a lot of time in this space, and I really just almost want to just sort of pay tribute to it and all its mysteries. And it was a very sensitive space, so we couldn't really touch it. It was the weirdest thing to be given the space you can't even touch, but we figured out a system to suspend, and anyway, but I wanted to create intimacy in this space and do like a ghost tapestry, or a tapestry that was sort of untelling itself or unraveling. And had this drop ceiling of this thread system that these chandelier pieces would penetrate. And one of the things that was taking place in Venice at the time, they were not allowing you to feed the birds anymore. You would like go to jail. So I wanted to the space had this odd inside-outside openness. I wanted to have the birds come in or invite them to come in. So these chandeliers were either encrusted in birdseed or had these sort of cups. But the other thing that these chandeliers were intended to do is to take the viewer beyond the drop ceiling and into the space beyond. And also another way I wanted to get the viewers to just look at the space, it was really all about just framing the space, was to bring in these performers and all. And these guys, this is what they do. I mean, this is an old hunting tradition from 700 plus years ago in this area outside of Venice. And it's a way of they would bring birds into nets and songbirds and eat them. And now what they do is they just do it, it's competition. And so they have this skill, but I really liked that they were stealth, that they just looked like viewers. And they'd be checking their cell phone and whistling. But the purpose they served for me was people were so convinced that there were birds in the room that they would look into all the crooks and crannies of the building, which is what I wanted. They'd be searching for the birds. So that was really, I can try. They have a name. They're called chiocolatori. They're the just lovely people, and they, they live in this one area and they compete. And one of the agreements, they were just so generous. I agreed to do their poster. They were having an upcoming competition. I agreed to do their poster for their 36-year tradition. And I'm getting to a project. I don't know if you know Jay Yan, but he's kind of came into my life through Jennifer Steinkamp, and has helped me with a number of projects. And I can't help but look at some of them and associate them with him because he saved my butt many times. And he should be graduated, by the way. Nope. So this was a project in Miami at the art fair, and this agency Creative Time approached me about helping them reprogram the space that used to have gallery shipping containers on the beach, which is there. It's like the size of half a football field, or a football field actually. And they wanted to have a stage for performers, and I really wanted to have a city, and I really wanted to have this flyaway city, or a city that was about to disappear. And it's very, very windy at this time of year, and we had to design it in a way that it wouldn't disappear, but something that looked one way during the day and then was transformed at night, sort of like, I don't know, I was looking at these sort of optical boxes, or I was playing around with this kind of night and day feeling, and they had almost no money, and I was struggling with the budget and trying to come up with a material that would do that. I didn't want to project inside of the buildings, but I know that digitally printed vinyl can look terrible if you do a photograph, but I think solid colors work great. And so we did this double-sided printing on this vinyl and had color on one side and then had black and white imagery on the back side. And so during the day, and then the city was just made of scaffolds. And I liked that this stuff was just thrown together, just like a scaffold city. But it was held up by all these kind of sarcophagi. You'll see the supports. And so at night, or during the day, you just get these bright volumes, these really high-key volumes, and then at night they would actually, this is pretty bright, but they were sort of more acid-washed. And as the light inside sort of brought the projection forward. And these wind slits serve this purpose for wind, obviously, but you could also stick your head in and see this kind of overly engineered structure on the beach. Oh dear, how much time do I have? I just want to, okay. This is a project that was shelved and has come back. And it's a project in San Diego for their North Embarcadero visionary plan. And they brought me in as an artist who was supposed to consult them on my own work. So it's a very strange conflict of interest type project, but I think they just wanted me to give them a piece of sculpture they could just put in their complex and I would just go away. But I recognized that their buildings seemed very boring, and they seemed almost like these building blanks. And one of the things that I learned on this project was going to these meetings every month, 1 or 2 meetings with these teams, and there's all this kind of, all these challenges with that, and people didn't want to have the bathroom, they didn't want to be responsible for the bathroom, so then I took the bathroom, and I said, I will deal with it, I want the bathroom. And then I saw these buildings that were so bad, and So I designed my proposal around making those buildings and changing them and understanding that I mean, it doesn't look like this now, but in the future, they plan all this development that will be looking down on that space. So I wanted to deal with those viewers and address them, and also the viewers on the ground. But I started with these pavilion roofs, and these pavilion roofs have these text penetrations that, you know, on the ground you'll start to see maybe some nice things will happen on the ground. And then to take those text openings and do these extrusions, these building extrusions, so the concessionaire in the cafe has to learn to function in a font, or has to work with the serif, and to have this kind of transparency, and to have this kind of have the vendor have a challenge, and you know have this kind of transparency. I'm interested in how cafes run from the backside, and to have these buildings that have that openness. And so there are these kinds of pavilion roofs with these shaped extrusions, and then this is the much maligned bathroom that I think is going to be great. And it's like a brise soleil, but without going all the way through. But it's these brise soleils without transparency that at night will hopefully, you know, depending on how it's lit, well, you know, maybe the openings fall in the right place, but the inside will be completely orange, and what will hopefully happen is you'll get this bounced fade of light that maybe the letter form opening at the top will be lighter and it'll be more intense at the bottom, and you just get this kind of outer fade. And this project happened last year. For those of you who know that MOCA has a new director, Jeffrey Dyke, who came to Los Angeles and embarked on this show, which is an interesting show because I think it was an outreach show, like a welcome to, you know, meeting, artist meeting, museum and meeting director and all this stuff. And he asked me to do two things here, to do this sort of branding of the exhibition. And I thought, I'm losing my train on this, but I wanted to do a bunch of iterations of it. And I thought that this show was so much about like love and friendship that, you know, we should put this on the end of the museum, and they did. And it was kind of nice to play around with, like, he was sort of being really open about it. And then this typeface just kind of went in different places and different iterations. And then he approached me about this really horrible space at the museum, which is the worst, which is always when I get a phone call, when there's some terrible space. And one of the things that the show also had in it, and they had these kind of genres, and they were really rigidly curated. So you had this room, which was light and space, this room, which was biomorphic abstraction, this room, which was pop. And I thought of this space as something that could bridge that and create like a hybrid of the pop, the light and space, the super graphics. And it was this long space. And I was thinking about hot dogs for some reason. I was thinking, this is mustard, this is the ketchup, and this is the relish. And then to create like this light and space hot dog that is super graphic, light and space, pop, and also just gets you through this challenging space. And so we did this string, it's actually still up, but there's this kind of string undulation that happens, and when you walk through the space, the contrast really vibrates, and it gets you through this horrible space. And then I painted this little bit of the rail like a pickle, or just this, there's this really ridiculous thing that they put this wall up and they let this bit of rail reveal. So odd. And now I'm going to show you these projects that I'm in process with, and it might be interesting for you to see the proposal material. You'll also see something that, you know, you never know if this stuff is really going to happen. So this is a project for Bradley, the expansion of Bradley Terminal, and it's one of the things that this airport, this particular architect likes to have a lot of light in his buildings, and that long corridor when you get off the plane and before you get processed through immigration, passport control, is called a sterile corridor. And because of this new kind of openness of the airports, there's a security concern, and you can maybe see there's a cable that's running every 4 inches on that frame. And I saw that as an opportunity for like a ghost tapestry, or like a, you know, why not make that security system into something entirely different, to art? And so, and this carpet is not necessarily going to be that way, but just taking the hot dog idea and thinking of this sort of undulation through the space, and what happens, this nice thing that you might see from the concourse below is this kind of endless sort of artwork. No, Jay did not do that. Some guy in San Diego did it. He did a great job, but it's actually, this project has changed radically since these were, these were generated, so we'll see. And then, now Jay did all this. Yes? Yeah, that's in the interesting part of the contract. I don't get to design it, but I get to weigh in. So it's in the contract that I participate in the selection, and yeah, no kidding. They love that purple. So this is a project that seemed impossible. It was, the entire competition was in German. I had to send my stuff in German, and I had to adhere to a very small budget, which I just ignored because I thought I would never get it. And I did get it, and it's been a really interesting challenge to try to figure out how to make this thing with this very small budget. But it's at the new Berlin-Brandenburg airport, which is going to be very large. And I don't know if it's going to be competition with Frankfurt, but I was just thinking of this transport, this sort of magical transport, and this flight and flyingness, and something that's unraveling and in space, and big monochrome, but something transparent, and thinking in terms of this being made out of drawn sort of with thin metal and undulating. And so this big flying carpet piece will be at the check-in hall when you walk in, hopefully. And you could hopefully see it from, I don't know, coming in. I doubt it, but maybe from a taxi. So Jay, this is a Jay rendering. But it's been really pretty interesting to work with the two airports at the same time, because the degree of expectation and security issues, it's unlike anything I've ever seen, really. But what ultimately happened was, because the budget on this is impossible, and I was about to tell them I couldn't do it, and I got a phone call from this person who makes Jeff Koons pieces in Germany, and he said, I want to make this. So he's taking the risk, and he's going to cover the cost with the hopes that through future marketing, we will get payment. And I think that idea of the marketing and the artwork is an interesting question. And how does that work out? That, you have a Super Bowl, the Frito-Lay Super Bowl, why couldn't you have like the Mercedes-Benz, Pae White artwork? Something, these are questions that we're going to be asking in terms of having something like this made. And this is the last thing I'm going to show you. It's something I recently did in Chicago. And the Art Institute has a new Renzo piano building. And one of the things they have is this sort of sculpture deck. And I've been there a number of times, and every time I've been there, they've had a three-dimensional object or two or three up there. And the viewers walk in that space, and they go right by the artwork, and they just go right to the view. And I thought I wanted to sort of change that configuration somehow and create this sort of other kind of story, or create this environment, or make the viewer the three-dimensional object, and just kind of thinking about the sky and thinking about a cartoon and a superhero, and like, let's say a rainbow fell from a cartoon and got trapped into this space and immersed all the ground. I was really interested in using this material that you might see they do advertising on the middle of streets now, and this stuff is, I think it's called street wrap. So just to have this continuity between the sides, which is one material, and the ground plane, but to have the viewer surrounded in this sort of giant super graphic and control that view, just completely take it down to a small aperture, and not frame anything. There's nothing really to frame, but just to have this kind of compression of that space. And so that just came down last couple weeks ago, and that is it.
Thanks, that was wonderful. I think we're ready for Q&A.
I've forgotten how you call the suspended pieces with the little colored paper,
Just hanging pieces?
the hanging pieces.
Yeah.
I can totally see how you build this and how you make this in the space. I have absolutely no clue how you take it down, put it in a box, and be able to do it again, because that looks like me like the greatest spaghetti nightmare I can think of. That you can be able to use it again. I don't know how that works.
I mean, I think I haven't installed one in a while, but it's we kind of came up with a system to bring the top threads down and then tie the strands from the ground up, so you're not like doing this kind of unfurling. And then the other thing is when we take it apart, we wrap it around a baggie. We wrap it around a stick or a piece of cardboard and then put it in a baggie. Very. I prefer not to install them. Oh, here's water.
I think that one of the great things about, seeing this kind of like rat-a-tat-tat presentation of so much great work is you almost single-handedly, but also with like a group of artists in your generation, kind of got rid of that horrible art versus design and really changed the verses to an and or a with. And I think that, that's not much of a question, but I'm just interested in, how you see that dialogue evolving for you. Like, are you just going to keep not really caring that much about what people say about art versus what people say about design, or?
Yeah, I mean, I liked, it's funny because when I was really doing a lot more catalogs, it was very tricky for, especially like a catalog for an exhibition that I might also be in. And it was interesting to see how the museum people would deal with me, because in one sense, they want to get pissed off at the slow designer, but they want to be nice to the artist who's in the show. So there was this kind of a dilemma of, who's under contract and who's doing what. But for me, I always set out to make an artwork. It just maybe has that kind of language of design. And in the case of some of the earlier books, I was really interested in the book setting out to be the thing that stands in place of the images. So the book could be kind of an installation, and the concerns that I had with doing an installation were really addressed in a book. For instance, the white walls of the space and the white pages of the paper and the viewer, the sequence, the budget, all those things. I would just, maybe the book is a thing that lasts after the show comes down, and it just kind of demonstrates certain aspects of the exhibition, or it stands in as an artwork in the exhibition. Things like that I was really interested in. I haven't been able to design a book because I'm very slow with it. I haven't been able to do it in a while, but yeah, I just see these as tools. Really, a bed is it's a bed, but it's also a sculpture. For me, it's just a familiar tool. But it's a question that comes up a lot.
I notice you use the word super graphic a lot, which is, I think, a specifically California, even crazier LA phenomena. Like billboards, sides of buildings. Do you think that the LA, is there an LA connection to your work or what you see in the city, sort of in the way you lay things out? Is there?
I think inevitably I'm influenced by all that stuff. I don't know if super graphic is specific to Los Angeles, because maybe it's specific to California. I think of examples that are important to me, and they're not specific to LA. Which?
Well, people
you
are
mean-
upset about billboards and super graphics on the side of buildings.
Oh, well, yeah, there's the billboard ordinance.
Yeah, so I thought, yeah.
I don't know, I mean, I also really like the large-scale text. When I think of super graphics, I also think of like large-scale text pieces, and But I don't really think of billboards. I've never really used them in that application. It's always just been a super graphic in a different kind of context. But I like the language of advertising a lot, and I like those tools and the sort of efficiency, and it's really interesting to work with people who are of the signage industry. I think that's always interesting. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think of like in Sea Ranch, I don't know if anybody's been to Sea Ranch, California, but they have, all their bathrooms were super graphics from the 70s and big symbols and big signs, and that was very important to me. And I guess it's just also that it is just almost just a membrane, that it's just this thing that is just barely there. It has a questionable volume that I like.
One last question.
I don't know. I wish I didn't sometimes. I just kind of.
What draws you to like color? You seem to have like an affinity towards it.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think it's just not being able to make a decision or not being able to commit to a decision about one or the other, so I just do them all. It's really, it's true. I'm serious. I really think it's not, because I really would like to not always sort of default. I sometimes find that it seems like a bit of a default but it just happens every time. And yeah, it's just something I'm drawn to, I guess. Indecisiveness.
Could you talk a little bit about research, like how you research a public project versus like a more like a gallery show, or do you see a difference there, the way you approach them?
Yeah, there's a big difference. God, it's hard to say. I think the contingencies are very different, and there is this kind of with the public works. I guess it's, again, I'm thinking of like, where's the light, where's the viewer, where's the momentum, where's the approach, and then I start kind of working through things that I might just happen to be interested in that time. I mean, each condition is different. I think of the Opera House, and it really did have to do with just, I guess that was sort of everything. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain. I'm just trying to think of each instance. At LAX, the given was this security system, and that sort of became already an available sort of situation. And in San Diego, I knew that there was this contingencies of them having architecture and money for that, and so those were already kind of present. So sometimes it's just taking what's already present and manipulating it, and in some cases it's some other criteria. But I tend to want to avoid the kind of the work that tells the neighborhood all the things that they should be or that they are, and that's what I really, maybe I'm just talking about myself, maybe that's the only thing I have any authority on, but maybe it's just my interest in what I respond to in that space. And it's different. A gallery show is really, it's always different, but it's kind of work that I've been, I'm kind of working through, or I'm working on a show right now and I'm really struggling, but things that I just kind of happen to be working on at this moment, I guess. Working through the different situations. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, yeah, look out. There's a certain amount of pleasure in your work, and it's really exuberant, and it makes you happy. I guess just talk about that, or is that an intention, I suppose?
Not at all. It's funny because I'm like not that way at all. Or I'm always surprised when I hear that, because I always feel so grumpy about doing it and dealing with the stuff, and I don't know why. You too. And I don't know if this maybe, you know, trying to cheer myself up or you know, why that is, but I guess it is. Does that kind of have that exuberance? I'm not answering any of these questions well.
All right. Well, thank you for this great opening and applause.